SCALA 2, that's what I'm going to be talking about. So starting from the ground, SCALA 2 and the SCALA 2 Lite, check our review of that. They are very similar gliders. Hannes Papesh, the designer and owner of Fi, says they are basically the same glider, the same line layout and stuff like that. The difference is in the materials and the construction. Without a doubt, they are quite similar to launch and fly. So by watching the SCALA 2 Lite review that we got, you get some idea as well from there. Having said that, I think that the SCALA 2 seems to have more reinforcement in it, more rods, and it certainly, you can feel the extra weight of it. So it's not a light glider. It's got lots of quite long rods on it, which is sort of a bit of a departure for Fi in a way, or a bit different to some of their other wings, which have tended to have quite minimalistic rods. They seem to be adding more reinforcement to make the gliders more solid and collapse resistant. The new generation, the Mark IIs, seem to be going that way, and that's, I think, since the Fi Beat has been a bit more that way. The gliders seem to have become more solid and more collapse resistant, but at the same time keeping the handling and the agility. It's quite often when the gliders get more solid and collapse resistant, they lose feeling and don't have as much feedback and lose agility. So that's the challenge, I think, for designers, is they need to get the gliders to be nicely solid and collapse resistant, but not so solid that you can't feel anything through them. Despite the aspect ratio being a little bit higher than some of the other ENC2 liners, I think it's, off the top of my head, it's just under 6.8, somewhere around there, where the others, the other high C ENC2 liners are more around the 6.5 aspect ratio. And so with that higher aspect ratio, I was wondering, is the pilot demands going to be much higher, or how different are they going to be? So that was really interesting, and that's both on the ground and in the air. And actually I found the pilot demands are really quite similar. Despite the extra aspect ratio, they're very similar to the Ozone Photon, the Nivic Arctic R, Air Design Volt 4, for example, and those gliders with a higher aspect ratio. So despite that, actually the pilot demands overall, like summing them up, is pretty similar. The actual characteristics of the gliders are actually quite different. So some of the gliders are easier in stronger winds and some are easier in lighter winds. So for example, Ozone Photon, I found, was in stronger winds actually very good and nice to manage. And in lighter winds, it's kind of not the easiest glider to launch, but when the wind picks up a bit, then they're actually really good. And conversely, for example, the Nivic Arctic R, that's really good in light winds and inflates really easy and comes up nice. But when the conditions start to get quite strong, like top end and very gusty, then the Arctic R is a bit more of a handful. I mean, perfectly fine for the class, but just a bit less forgiving of errors kind of pulling up too hard. And I found with the SCALA 2, it's an all-rounder. So in light winds, I think in very light winds, it's maybe a little trickier than the Arctic R, maybe, but it's kind of more of an all-rounder. So even in strong conditions, I found it inflates and comes up and doesn't have a tendency, what it doesn't have is a tendency to just kind of whip up. And in the light conditions, it doesn't have a tendency to kind of not want to inflate and come up and drag along the ground when you're trying to launch in nil or a tailwind. It's not quite as easy as the lower C ENC2 liners like the Jin Bonanza 3, and now I've flown the Nova Codex quite a bit, and those gliders are easier, but they're sort of more of around the mid-C kind of category and with their lower aspect ratios. If you're looking at a high C glider, then the SCALA 2 is perfectly fine for that. What I was wondering is, with that aspect ratio, is it going to turn out to be a D and C clothing? And actually it's not at all. I find it's yeah, right for the class, but definitely towards the higher end of the high C, like the Ozone Photon and the Nivic Arctic R. So one little comment to make. So I mentioned in our review of the SCALA 2 Lite that it has a little bit of a tendency for the tips to come up, and the SCALA 2 does as well, but less. So I think there must be a difference in the reinforcement and construction, maybe also the difference in materials. And the SCALA 2 does have a bit of a tendency for the tips to come up through the middle, so when you launch it, it's best to launch from the middle, and then it comes up really nicely. But it doesn't have quite as much of a tendency as the SCALA 2 Lite does of the tips kind of rolling round themselves a bit, and so it's actually a bit easier to manage. That's not but I'm talking about in strong winds here, so, and that's not unusual for ultralight gliders. Tend to be more of a handful in stronger winds because they just blow up in the wind and flap around more. So I found that when launching in a really strong wind, and then it's much better to bring the glider around the edge of the wind window rather than pulling it through the power zone. because of the more closed cells, it's a little bit slower to pull on the tips. But actually I found what that makes for me, once you've just practiced it a bit, same with the SCALA 2 Lite, I found that once you did that a bit, it actually made the glider come up just a little bit more calmly, and as you brought it around the edge of the wind window of the power zone. And actually that's what you want when it's really strong. So some gliders will inflate too quick and then come up and kind of pull you across the takeoff. So, and I did launch with both the SCALA 2 and the SCALA 2 Lite in quite strong conditions and quite strong winds, and found them really well manageable. On launch, it's, I think because of the very good performance and the very solid nature of the glider, and it's very stable above your head, doesn't tend to wander off and move around a lot. On launch I found it's very good for takeoff, even when the conditions are quite sort of varied and gusty. You can get the glider up nicely, and then as you take off you have a really good communication for the wings. So I found it really good for launch. On launch, as soon as you take off into the air, the feeling of the SCALA 2, well, for me, I'm going to talk about it from a personal level a bit as well. Immediately you feel the glider feels very solid, and despite the extra aspect ratio, it's actually more solid and moves around less than some of the other wings. The one that from my other reviews you may pick up was the Ozone Photon, particularly comes to mind, that it kind of has a tendency to move and snake about. It's just how the glider is, and you get used to that. And as I've said before, it's not I don't like that so much. But with the SCALA 2, it's got a very solid feeling about it, and despite the extra aspect ratio, it actually feels like it moves around less. It has got a bit more movement than some of the other ENC2 liners, so particularly again the easier ones, and which are very solid and monoblock. So there's a little bit more movement than that, but I feel for me a very comfortable. I flew even some very sporty conditions where it was kind of windy and turbulent and rough, and the glider gave me a feeling of confidence. So that was really good, and it is a talkative glider. It does give you a feeling of what's going on in the air. Actually, I'm overstating it. It's not talkative as in, like, say, it's not like a chatty talkative glider that's moving around a lot, but it does give good feedback. So even when you're flying in the light scratchy conditions, which I did fly the SCALA 2 in quite a bit, and you can really feel where the best bit of lift is. You can sniff it out and follow the lifty lines, and I found it really nice for that, and that's really good. And then when you move on to stronger conditions, that glider, because it has a very solid kind of collapse resistant and confidence inspiring leading edge, you still feel comfortable and confident in it. Well, I do, certainly. And I do feel like the SCALA 2, it's just spot on. It's got for the level of pilot, they want to know what's going on in the air, they want to know where the lift is, and when it's a bit lighter and more fickle kind of subtle conditions, they want to know where the lift is and make the most out of it to get up, because even on a really good day you can have that happen. And at the same time, when it gets feisty and strong, you want a glider that feels really solid and confidence inspiring, and those are two kind of opposite things. They're kind of fighting against each other, so that must be a real challenge for designers to do that. And I can see designers who've been doing it for longer seem to be managing to get that right. Well, I guess not many designers have been doing it longer than Hannes, so that's maybe partially how he's managed to do it. But I really do feel like the SCALA 2, it's got a really good balance of that. And as well as being able to feel and work out the really scratchy stuff, I was then thinking, oh, this is going to be a bit feisty when I get in strong conditions. But somehow when you fly in the strong conditions, it's sort of almost like the glider tightens up or something. It just feels very solid and yeah, very collapse resistant. And yeah, it's almost like as you fly in stronger conditions, the glider just seems to feel almost more confidence inspiring. So to be honest, it's a little bit like paradoxical. I'm not exactly sure how he's managed that, but that's the feeling that I have. So now talking about the handling, well, this is where I think the SCALA 2 kind of shines out. Straight away, flying out onto some thermals, and when our little UK hills, we quite often have to get into the lift and kind of hook into a little core, or even when we're ridge soaring, we have to really be able to turn quite tightly and agile to get into the lift. And with the original SCALA 1, it's certainly one on that had a pretty amazing agility, pretty surprising for that level of glider. That was a mid-D glider supposedly, although That's just because they weren't allowing collapse lines in the C class at that time. But yeah, the SCALA 1 had real agility, but it wasn't so efficient in its climbing, and in weak stuff, if you turned really tight, you weren't climbing quite so well. So with the SCALA 2, Hannes seems to have managed to get the glider to turn almost, not quite as agile as the SCALA 1, is my feeling, but pretty damn close, but turning flatter and more efficiently. So the glider has a better sink rate and a better climb rate, and that is what I was really hoping for in the SCALA 2, and it does have that, but it's got lost a little bit on the agility side to get that, and so to make the glider turn just more efficient and flatter, yeah, I guess it's just lost a little edge in agility, but then it's still, and this is the key thing, from all the gliders that I tested in the ENC class so far, the ENC 2-liners, it's the most agile, the most responsive, and the most agile of them. Even now, a little bit more than the Arctic R, which is the glider that I said before, I found the most agile and responsive in the class. Well, let's talk about thermaling and the climb rate of the SCALA 2. My overall feeling, now having flown the SCALA 2 and the SCALA 2 Lite quite a bit, is they climb really, really well. The sink rate and the climb rate are very good already. Add to that the exceptionally agile, responsive handling, and then you've got a glider that climbs really, really well. At no point flying with other gliders, even higher rated D gliders and even comp gliders, at no point did I feel disadvantaged at the climb, even in weak, scrappy stuff. And most of the time I felt like I had an advantage over most other pilots around. This is even though I was quite well loaded on the glider, flying it heavier, and it still climbed really, really well. On that note, I tried flying the SCALA, as I generally do with gliders, I tried flying the SCALA 2 Lite and the SCALA 2 in different parts of the rate ranges. I think, obviously if you're flying, it depends on the conditions, but the main point I want to make is I actually found them surprisingly tolerant of flying in different parts of their weight ranges. I wouldn't fly them right near the bottom of the weight range, of course, unless it was very light, scratchy conditions. I did do that, and then you have a really nice mincy glider that can stay up and soar around where others are not staying up. It does cope with that, but I wouldn't say that's a good idea when you're flying in thermic conditions. Yeah, the climb rate is really, really good, and that really nice agile handling, coupled with the fact that it stays flat and turns efficient, and that you can really micro adjust on all the bits of the lift, make it a really exceptionally good climber. That's my feeling. So now what about performance? In general, we talked about the climb rate. What about glide? Well, I've done quite a bit of flying now, the SCALA 2. You can see we've got various tips videos. All of the testing I did, without any exception, showed that it has a really good glide. Very good in all conditions, light and strong headwinds. Gliding with other pilots who are flying Photons and Arctic Rs. And I never felt disadvantaged on the SCALA 2, and I always felt like I might have a bit of an advantage, if anything. And that's just at trim. And the glider is quite quick at trim, so it has a really good trim speed, but not like the SCALA 1, which felt almost a little bit over fast. It was trimmed definitely for speed, and you kind of wanted to hold it back a bit. I think that Fee have got the trim speed and the trim of the glider just absolutely spot on, and it's got a really good glide performance. And so as you're soaring around and flying about, you just feel like you've got really good reach out from the hill. From our little hills, you just feel like you can go and explore more and reach about. And you think, oh, there's a scratchy climb right on front. I'm not very high, but oh yeah, I feel like I can go out and go and reach and get the climb, which is really nice. Now, talking about on bar, well, first of all, right through the speed range, the SCALA 2 stays very solid. In fact, it might almost tighten up at the top end of the speed. It's very, very solid on bar, and it's very quick. I think I was picking up around 20 k's an hour of increase of speed over trim at least. Because as you're gliding and you're going through active air, you're quite often moving about, and you can look at your ground speed going up and down, up and down. So it's difficult to quantify exactly, but I felt like it's definitely fast. Again, gliding with others, always when I was on full bar, I was pulling away from others. The only time I wasn't was when I was flying with Martin on his Enzo 3, and that's got more speed. So a comp glider, as you'd expect, has a higher top end speed. From my testing so far, it seems like it's the best performing ENC two-liner I've flown. You need to be the right kind of level of pilot to be flying that, because if you do hit some really big turbulence, I mean, it's very collapse resistant, I think exceptionally so, but every paraglider collapses eventually, and of course if you're on full bar and you have a big blowout, it's going to be dynamic and challenging, so make sure that you're flying the right level of glider for you. So don't think, oh great, this sounds fantastic, this wing, I'm going to jump up from my high B or something like that and go straight to a SCALA 2. That might be okay for some pilots, but I think for most pilots, going from a high B wing and jumping straight up to a high C is a bit of a big step. Now let's talk about when you're on bar and then you're using the rear risers to control the glider. Well, the communication through the rear risers, the Bs, is really excellent. Its predecessor, the SCALA 1, was almost disconcertingly light. It was really light. It's the lightest two-liner I've ever felt on the rear risers. In fact, the lightest any glider I've ever felt. It's the rear risers on the SCALA 1 were almost like brakes. They were so light. But with the SCALA 2, they firmed up a bit, so they're kind of moderate pressure. I still think they're actually lighter than quite a few gliders. That's because some of them are quite heavy, which makes them like hard work and hard to use, and you've got less feeling. For me, the SCALA 2 has got a really nice balance on the rear risers. Speaking of descent techniques, of course the fastest way to get down generally is spiral dives, and there's nothing to report particularly. The SCALA, well, it's fast, it's got long lines, no surprises. It does the G's on the spiral dives are quite high, but very normal for the class. I didn't find any tendency for the glider to lock in or wind in and get stuck in a spiral, so that was nice. The glider, because of its responsiveness on the handling, you can adjust and bring around the spiral and go into a sort of just a tight 360 if you just wanted to get a bit of an increase of descent rate, 6-8 meters a second. And then if you want to wind it in and go into a full spiral, you can really spiral the glider down hard and get a very high descent rate. But then of course you are pulling quite high G's. Wingovers, that's another thing. And their SCALA 2, no surprises with that, very agile handling, lots of speed, lots of energy conversion. It's an absolute joy to wing over. You can build up and do some very big wing overs with it and build them up quite quickly. Because the glider is so solid, it tends to stay really nicely inflated. So assuming you're doing your wing overs correctly, then it's a real joy, an absolute beauty to wing over, really fun. So I've really enjoyed doing that on it. The SCALA 2, I'm really pleased to say, does do what it's really good for doing is the outer B lines, which are labelled C3s, and it does that, the bunny ears, or tip stalls, bunny ears, the B ears, whichever you prefer to call them, and it does those very well. The pressure to pull them in, as usual, is quite high. It's not as high as some, so it's very usable, and the ears come in really nicely, so the bunny ears come in and sit very nicely, gives you a really good increase in descent rate. And so I found that very usable, and that's definitely the descent technique that I would use for that. I tried doing classic big ears with the outer A's, because looking at the lines it looked like you might be able to pull them in, but there is a connection between the A's and the A's are split at the top, so they split out slightly. So, and I didn't manage to pull them in, I just didn't pull hard enough. Benny, one of Fee's main test pilots, said that you can do the classic big ears. What you do is you put a bit of bar on first to bring down the angle of attack, and then you reach up and give them a really hard pull, and you can do classic big ears on the SCALA 2 as well. So I haven't done that myself, I will try and test that out. So as you've worked out from this, I do personally rather like the SCALA 2, very enjoyable to fly, and it just invites me I just want to go out and fly it some more. So I do really like it personally. If you're a pilot that's flying a high B gliders, I've had some pilots who are flying high B wings asking, is it a good idea to upgrade to one of these new ENC two-liners? Well, I'd say that it's not so much about the two-liner, three-liner thing, in my opinion. I'd say it's more about the sort of pilot demands of the different gliders. Now that I've flown more of them, including the Nova Codex, which is now the new lowest pilot demands of any ENC two-liner I've flown, and the Jin Bonanza 3, well, they've got a mid-C kind of pilot demand. So that's the kind of glider that I think would be a good upgrade from a high B. I think these higher end, high C gliders, it's a big jump from a high B to a high C. And that's all right for some pilots, but I'd generally not advise that. So if you're FE pilot and you're flying a FE Maestro 2 and you're thinking about upgrading, but at the moment FE have got the Allegro and you're not really going to gain anything in performance, maybe a little bit of top end speed, you're not really going to gain anything in glide or anything like that. So really pilots are looking to upgrade. If you're sort of sticking with a brand, you're looking to upgrade, you'd be thinking about the SCALA 2, and I think that's a pretty big jump because the Maestro 2 it's got actually quite easy pilot demands despite having top performance in the class. Its pilot demands are relatively easier in the high B class. If you're flying one of the hotter high Bs like the Gin Explorer, then the step up is not so big, but I'd still encourage, say for most pilots, the step up from a high B should be to a mid C, whether it's a 2 or 3 liner.